Hey there, folks. Thank you so much for joining us for this penultimate session for our SNAP 21 virtual conference. I am joined today. I'm very excited to introduce you all today to two great guys I've had the chance to work with, Dr. Chris Longhurst and John O'Malley, our leaders of SNAP New Zealand Aotearoa. Apologies if I butchered that, Chris. And they have been integral parts of the current Royal Commission into Faith-Based Care inquiry that is going on. And I've invited them here to talk to you a little bit about their efforts on behalf of clergy abuse survivors in New Zealand and Oceania. So thanks to you both so much for joining, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Zach. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Zach, you pronounced that beautifully, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. Before we start, I'd just like to remember all of those people who died or were affected by the 9/11 attacks on the United States. 2 New Zealanders were also killed in those events. So I'd just like to remember them all, and I'd especially like to acknowledge and thank the SNAP staff for making this conference available to us all. This afternoon, we're looking at SNAP's involvement in the New Zealand Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care, and there are 4 brief parts to this presentation. The first is a look at what a Royal Commission is, and then we're going to move into the key facts about this particular Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. And then we're going to look at SNAP's participation in the inquiry, and in particular, a highlight for us. And then I'll pass it over to John O'Malley, here present with us, who will talk to us about SNAP Aotearoa moving us forward with our special call for an independent, statutory, survivor-led redress body. So by way of introduction, and just in sum, a Royal Commission, in short, is the most serious response to an issue available to a British Commonwealth government to address. And it can investigate any matters that it seems fit to determine the cause of and what to do about it. The Commission recommends policy or legislative changes to prevent whatever it is from happening again. And while the government establishes its terms of reference, which set out the purpose and scope of the inquiry, the Commission is independent from the government and from all other agencies such as churches, and the chair and the commissioners decide how it is to be run and who it reports to, which is the Governor-General in New Zealand, the head of state's representative. This inquiry was set up by the New Zealand government on the 1st of February in 2018 in response to public calls for a broad-based investigation into abuse in care. However, at that time, the inquiry was into historical abuse in state care only, or into institutions run by government agencies. However, at the same time, hundreds of submissions advocated for expanding the scope to include abuse in faith-based care as well, or in places run by churches. So around that time, I was among those who lobbied to include churches, and I wrote to New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, arguing that it would be unfair if the abuse that I suffered as a child at a Catholic school, which is integrated with the state here in New Zealand, were excluded from the inquiry. And I claimed that such an exclusion would amount to a form of discrimination, I believed. So in August 2018, the Prime Minister replied to me personally in a letter, and she assured that the government was still considering the inquiry's terms of reference, and she asked me to be patient. Then on November the 20th, 2018, the government formally released the inquiry's terms of reference, which were extended to include abuse in the care of faith-based institutions. So now the inquiry is formally called the New Zealand Royal Commission into Historical Abuse in State Care and in the Care of Faith-Based Institutions. And this inquiry, everyone, is New Zealand's largest, longest, and most complex and expensive inquiry ever. And still later, the commissioners were to clarify that what is meant by in the care of faith-based institutions was to also include faith-based situations as well. Because as we know, a priest who is in a relationship with anyone is an agent of the church, and therefore a priest who, for example, would take a child in his car to a park or to an ice cream parlor and abuse that child, that was a faith-based situation that was included in the inquiry. So it wasn't simply about institutional abuse, but about in churches, but also about situations where that professional relationship between the actor and the child being acted upon, or the victim, was involved as well. So the inquiry started to hear evidence in January 2019. And in February 2019, I received a request to meet with the commissioners, and probably because of my engagement with the Prime Minister shortly before that matter, that the commission reached out to me to come to them to talk and provide survivor-based input. But things got quite awkward, because when I raised an issue about potential conflicts of interest, given that there were 3 of the 5 commissioners who had religious affiliations and 2 were devout Catholics, again, things got awkward, and that's when the press got involved, and that's when I felt my own story getting out of my hands, getting into the press, and now I was being seen as an advocate for survivors, which happened quite spontaneously. But that's when I reached out to SNAP in the United States, because there wasn't any body, any group of a support group here in New Zealand that was specializing or understood that extra layer of complexity around faith-based abuse. So I reached out to you guys, to Tim, to Melanie, and to Zach, and they had a SNAP chapter up and running here in New Zealand within a matter of weeks. So briefly looking at this particular inquiry, which is different because of the way New Zealand is set up to what North America is dealing with on its state-by-state basis. So it's a national inquiry, and it's a commission that's looking into abuse of children, young people, and vulnerable adults. And I add to that adults at risk, because I don't consider myself a vulnerable person, but I was at risk when I went into the confessional, when I went to a priest for advice, at school, even as a young man, I was at risk. So it's looking at those who were in the care of state agencies and churches across New Zealand between 1950 and 1999, but also has discretion to consider abuse that occurred before 1950 and after 1999 as well, and even regarding people who are in care today. How does it work? Basically, the commission receives information in several ways: by listening to people, by holding public hearings, and by receiving submissions in writing. And it also has powers to subpoena, to require people and institutions, including the government and its agencies and churches, to give information and documents. And it also does research. It has several ways that it can hear from people. There is a contact center that receives initial reports, and there are also private meetings with the commissioners. There are public hearings, and there's a roundtable discussion, and there's also people or organizations that can make formal submissions to it. So that's how it hears from people. And there are 7 key questions that it is wanting answers to. The first is why people were taken into care, including if there was bias, for example, or discrimination, if there was manipulation of persons in professional relationships, or if there was bad decision making by institutional leaders. The second one is what abuse and neglect actually occurred. So it's looking at what took place and to what extent, the nature of the abuse. It's looking at why it occurred, what factors made it possible for the abuse to occur. It's looking at what effects this had on the person abused, and also on their family, and even on wider society. It's looking at what was learned, what changes were made over the years in response to the abuse, if any, including to laws. And it's looking at how well the systems are working today or not working, including current redress and rehabilitation processes, what's taking place today. And finally, it's looking at how things can be done better in the future. How does the Commission report? It will prepare at least 2 reports. An interim report, which was delivered already in December last year, and a final report, which is now due by the 30th of June 2023. The interim report estimated that about 250,000 people in New Zealand were abused in state and faith-based care. Given how many people were in care, that's just under 40% of our nation that was in care were abused. Though even this figure is believed to be conservative based on modelling, and it will be impossible, the experts say in this field of research, to determine the precise number of people abused because of data gaps and deficiencies, and the fact that many victims, as we all know, and survivors simply don't come forward. The New Zealand Catholic Church alone has had in excess of 1,100 complaints lodged against it, and that was just a preliminary figure last March. Most of those abused in state care were from Māori and Pacifica families, therefore Indigenous peoples, and disabled people, and women and girls in state care. And most survivors of faith-based care who were abused were children, especially young boys and adolescent boys between the ages of 10 and 13. Abusive behavior in state care ranged from common physical assault and sexual abuse through to cruel and degrading treatment and punishment. And almost all abuse in faith-based care was sexual and psychological. It was reported that redress processes so far had been overly focused on financial implications to the institutions, rather than on providing appropriate compensation to survivors and ensuring survivor well-being. And it was also reported that survivors who made claims were frequently disbelieved and forced to retell their stories again and again, which was re-traumatizing for them. Before 2023, the final report will come out, and that will look at the nature of the abuse, the extent of the abuse, and what impact it had on people, and what's been improved and what still needs to be done. At the time of its final report, the Commission will make recommendations to the government and to churches about changing the laws and ways of working, and what needs to happen to prevent and respond to abuse in the future, and what needs to be done to support people who have been abused, for example, redress, rehabilitation, and compensation processes, and also what apologies are still needed. Now, moving into the third part, which for me is the most exciting, this is about SNAP's role in the second phase of the faith-based redress hearing, which ran for 2 weeks this past March. And SNAP had core participant status. That's John and me representing SNAP at phase 2 of the redress hearing. But this phase, late last year, phase 1 focused on the experiences of survivors seeking redress. So this phase 2 focused on witnesses from churches, so church leaders giving their testimony on their processes for resolving historic abuse and current abuse claims. And the witnesses included officials of New Zealand's Salvation Army, the Anglican Church, and the Catholic Church here in New Zealand, and they presented their evidence. And we, SNAP, were there to present our opening statement and our closing statement. The opening statement was delivered by me and our legal representation, Cooper Legal, on March 22nd, and our closing statement was presented on March 30th. And at the end of this presentation, there are links for anyone who would like to read those statements or actually listen to them recorded online. Basically, just to give you an overview of what it was like, each day there in the chamber, there were about 40 people who sat in a room especially designed for the hearing. It was a windowless grey room above an Irish bar in a really swanky neighbourhood in Auckland, in Newmarket in Auckland. And a group of senior clerics in civilian dress, wearing suits and ties, all of them, the archbishops and the cardinal, Metropolitan of New Zealand. They were all sitting rather motionless on the left side of the room with their communications advisors and public relations people, while most of the survivors and their supporters sat on the right side of the room, and lawyers were filing in and out. It was really a deceptively muted setting for what was effectively a reckoning with New Zealand's most shameful strain of religious history, and systemic sexual abuse by priests and bishops of children and adults at risk, and its cover-up by bishops and congregational leaders. So the mood was quite somber, and of course there was a tension, but it was very formal and very polite. And surprisingly, it was rather emotionless overall, except for one survivor that I recall who on one occasion exhibited offence at the reporting on how abuse was being classified as minimal, and minimal payments were being awarded, and she exited the room rather angrily, cursing at the clerics at the back row about this attempt to classify abuse. And I learned that one of my own complaints against one of my own high school teachers when I was a high school student back at my high school, St. John's College in Hastings, I learned right there and then that abuse, one of 4 cases I filed, was classified as, quote, a simple case of a relatively minor matter. And the reason why I knew that is because it was being disclosed that those who were offered $5,000 were for, quote, a simple case of a relatively minor matter. And that upset me too, because it certainly wasn't, from my point of view, a simple case of a rather minor matter. So I was quite happy to see the woman get emotional, curse the clergy and walk out. But apart from that, it really was a rather emotionless and somber event. And there were certainly some uncomfortable moments for the church, admissions of missing files and a serious lack of training for the clergy. But I'd like to share with you one of the funniest moments, at least from my point of view. And forgive me, I find this funny, and other people found it funny too. But there's really nothing funny about this. But I want to share with you one of the moments that caught the media's attention, which was when the counsel for the commission was questioning the Anglican Bishop of Auckland about his church's outreach to victims and survivors, and the telephone line that they had set up to help victims and survivors. So have a listen to what happened.
Just to get back, so they received the call. Would they take notes or make a record? What would happen in terms of process at that point?
Yes, they would take some notes and make a record of the phone conversation, and then would, as soon as possible, discuss the matter with me, bring it to my attention as a complaint that has arisen.
And then in your bishop's role, you would direct the response to that disclosure?
Yes.
So are you confident that if you dialed that now, that you would get the diocesan manager?
The DDI that's there? Yes. That is her DDI.
Just want to test that because would it surprise you to know that when we've dialed that number, it goes through to a number unobtainable?
That does surprise me, yes.
Have you got your phone with you?
Sure.
Would you like to pull it out and see what happens with the 09 prefix?
The number you've dialed is not currently allocated to a phone. Please check the number and redial.
So it appears there's a technology issue in the background there too. And we don't know how long that's been the case, do we?
And I can only express that I'm highly embarrassed by that.
That was just one of the gaffes there. And again, I apologise if I offend anyone by finding that quite funny. But at the hearing, the issue of systemic failure wasn't in question. I guess that was already accepted. That was a given. But the questions were about where the system failed and how redress was offered and what was being done today to prevent the failures from happening again. For the Catholic Church, we heard the testimony of the Marist Brothers delegate, Brother Peter Horide, and the Marist Fathers Provincial, Father Tim Duckworth, and the Metropolitan of New Zealand, Cardinal John Dew of Wellington. And we also heard from the director of the Catholic Church's National Office for Professional Standards, which is commonly called NOPS. It was Mrs. Virginia Noonan, and she was responsible for dealing with complaints of sexual abuse involving clergy and members of religious congregations across the country. The difficulty here is that all of these witnesses were largely discussing historical claims dealt with by members of their churches who had departed the system already. So they were talking about the failings of a system that included them, but was not necessarily their own personal failings. This was their claim. I think this was less true, however, for the NOPS director, because SNAP, we had filed a formal complaint against Mrs. Noonan for not upholding her own professional standards. And also Archbishop Dew was being questioned about his handling of current cases as well. But the highlight for SNAP came when the Catholic Church's Council was delivering the church's closing statement. And I'd like to share this with you because it was for both John and I and for our council the highlight. We had still not given our closing statement, right? So we've written our closing statement and we've submitted it to the commissioners. Imagine what's about to happen. It was a wonderful moment. Again, the Church's Council was giving her closing statement. She was making claims that the Church's redress was providing pastoral healing for victims and survivors. When the chair of the commission, Judge Coralshaw, interjected, quoting directly from our statement to refute what the Church's Council was saying. I think it was an enormously grand moment for us, because not only was what we had said now being heard, it was being stated by the chair of the commission herself to directly challenge what the Church's Council was claiming. And John and I just sat there beside each other, not believing our ears. And what was more exhilarating was when the lawyers at the front of the room turned around to look at us, sitting there representing SNAP at the back of the room, as the chair was quoting our closing statement to refute what the church was saying. I'd like to give you a quick listen to this. I'm going to have to stop my screen sharing now because I can't download this. It's live on the Abuse and Inquiry website. So I'm just going to stop my screen sharing and hopefully just play this section for you where the council again is giving her evidence, and she's interjected by the commissioner.
Pastoral support is often provided. And Commissioners, I'm conscious that this is not a concept that you will have necessarily heard about in the state hearings. This is not a feature of a state redress process. And it's also something that differs very much in terms of the detail between entities within the Catholic Church. There is evidence in Father Duckworth's brief, in Sister Sue France's brief, of the response of the Sisters of Mercy, and evidence from Cardinal John. There are common themes by what that they mean by pastoral care, but it differs between those entities, what they prioritise and how it is delivered.
Just on that point, we have the benefit, and I'm not sure if you have yet seen the closing statements from the Survivors Network.
No, Mum, I haven't.
It's unfortunate, and also from SNAP.
No, Mum.
I think it's only fair that I raise a couple of issues that they've raised to give you an opportunity to comment on behalf of the Church. Just talking about pastoral care, The evidence from, no, sorry, not the evidence, the closing statement of the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, that's SNAP, which questions whether the NOPS redress scheme is a healing process. It's referred to as a misnomer. Our members have described a path to healing as an inquisition, feeling they were the ones being put on trial. That Ms. Noonan spoke confidently about survivors coming with them, as with the Catholic Church, on their individual healing journeys. And the suggestion is that once trust has been lost by abuse and further betrayal, it's misguided to assume it can be so easily regained. Now, I appreciate I'm putting a lot to you, but I think this is the flavour of the distrust from SNAP of this process, which you have referred to as healing. And then finally, it said that Ms. Noonan claimed that survivors are offered support throughout the NOPS process. None can remember it. From our expectations, the NOPS process was never about us or our healing. It was about protecting the institution. Now, those, as I say, I think they're all, it's quite long, but I think it all says the same thing. And I think it's appropriate that you be given an opportunity at this stage, if you feel you can now, unless you'd like to take some instructions and get back to me. I think you're probably more than capable of responding.
No, Commissioner.
So again, that was a wonderful moment for us because we were being validated and we were being heard. And the press picked up on that too. You can hear and see the chair of the commission addressing the council online if you want to. But again, our voice was heard. It was echoed not only by the chair of the commission in direct rebuttal to the church's council, but also by the media. And here is what the spin-off reported. And I'll end on this note before I pass it over to John. This was published around that time. Quote, yesterday, at the conclusion of the faith-based redress part of the hearing, SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, leader Christopher Longhurst closed with this indictment referring to church redress. I can play this for you live at 41:54, I believe it is. Let's see if this works.
The fundamental issue regarding church redress and faith-based abuse is not that complex. The excuse of complexity is, for survivors, difficult to accept because the truth for us is really quite simple. We are talking about child sexual abuse in religious communities and institutional abuse and its cover-up, past and present. This needs to stop. And the people who enabled this need to be held to account. And the mechanisms that cause this need to be dismantled. And the victims and the survivors that suffered this need to be properly compensated.
So the chair quoting our closing statement, and that was the end of our closing statement. Before we presented it, it could have made our presentation anticlimactical, but it didn't. Instead, it allowed us to make that statement with more confidence and to repeat the truth, which in my view was in a sense a nail in the coffin of the credibility of the church's testimony. So that's the That's the end of my part of this presentation. In sum, SNAP's presented our opening statement and our closing statements, which are online for anyone who would like to read them, and our official formal submission on the 28th of April this year is also available in the public domain as well. But now I'm going to hand it over to John, who's going to talk to us about what came later in June this year, which was our submission on national redress. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody, from Wellington in New Zealand here, where if you see a flash in the back and hear thunder clapping, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm here. So there'll probably be a little bit of drama accompanying what I have to offer you this afternoon. I'll read through basically a number of slides that set out the current position and what we tried to propose as solution. So presently, the redress for victims comprises a complaint to the police. They'll only investigate where there is an independent witness who observed the offence, or there's a video of the offence, or there are a number of complaints against the same individual. And if you can't get it in one of those three, then the police can't help you. So then you go to the next one, which is if it's a state institution, we have a thing called an ombudsman who will look at things, but will come out with recommendations. Legislative clout is missing. Or in the case of a faith-based institution, they have their in-house processes, which are designed for self-preservation, as we've already heard. The survivors experience the beyond reasonable doubt of a police requirements too high a bar. It's an adversarial court system. Or the ombudsman, on the other hand, and the in-house faith-based organisation processes are basically inept. They sought to protect the organisations, their reputation, and to minimise harm to themselves, but they clouded it with a path to healing title, which is a bit of a con job, quite frankly. Survivors get a minimal look into the whole thing. And you're never told the outcome of it either, if you don't win. SNAP called on the Commission for an Independent Abuse and Care Authority, and the Commission responded in turn by calling for suggestions on what a redress scheme for survivors' claims for abuse or neglect might be by way of an out-of-court scheme. Chris, thanks. Next one. So SNAP Aotearoa, excuse me, and notice we proposed to the Commission, excuse me, an independent redress body that focused on survivors' needs for healing, empowerment to live a purposeful life. It be survivor-led. That is, you're the most important people. So you start the process. Be judicial in nature under the Ministry of Justice and report to the Governor-General. Review personal, be mature persons skilled in law, counselling, psychology and community experiences. So the people actually you're dealing with have got to come from the right background. There must be no conflicts of interest, and the redress comprises two processes. One, the inquiry, and two, an assessment. Slide, please. Thanks. So first, the inquiry. It's a simple question. What actually happened? So fact gathering from survivors on the basis of what is being told is true. So you as a survivor tell us, and we start from the premise you're telling the truth to the best of your ability. And the light of that, survivors at their request can have expert people around them to help you take part objectively. You have to get facts out, and the pain and hurt comes into play, but we have to try and help you stay objective, because without that, you can't go in a structured manner forward. Then we have an inquisitorial investigator to be appointed to each case, where the legal function is to focus on the best questions to be asked to establish truth from all concerned, to discover and establish where supporting evidence may lie and collect it. And the body must have legal power to investigate claims, power of discovery of documents, power of subpoena and cross-examination, and power to override the secret provisions of any organisations, including faith-based. And secondly, when you've got all that together, and look at the case, is an assessment. And where two or more persons possessing the qualities I mentioned earlier, they would review and assess the validity of the complaint on the balance of probabilities. But there needs to be guidance criteria to be established for the degree of application of the balance of probabilities. The difficulty with it is it can mean different things to different people in different situations. And recommendations then as to personal support for rehabilitation and financial compensation. But the reasons for assessment decision, including if it's declined, then the complainant be published with the right of a review process. So everything's out in the open and on the table. So the thing comes down to, you can make a complaint, but we then have a process that starts it as being true, and we find some process of bringing it to its fruition so that your complaint has got credibility in the eyes of independent people. Now that's our suggestion. Will it be bought into? Who knows? We've a long way to go, but that's the approach we're taking, and let's see what happens and what our attempts are. Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, John. And I'd just like to underemphasize for us, I think SNAP's difference here is that we're calling for a survivor-led redress system, not just survivor-centered. And by survivor-led, we understand the risks that are involved, and that's why we need to have people around with us. But we're in charge, we're in control of this, where we can be. So it's survivor-led, not just survivor-focused. And the rationale behind this, everyone, is simply SNAP's model of healing ourselves by supporting other people. So if we support each other, and if we're gainfully employed in this redress system, then that's also part of the healing. Can you imagine survivors themselves for the first time ever gainfully employed in a redress system, not having lawyers or advocates or other people getting paid to do a job to heal us, but we're getting paid to do that job ourselves? I think this is revolutionary. I don't know where it's happening right now, if it's happening at all, but SNAP New Zealand is not calling for just an independent statutory body. It's calling for a survivor-led independent statutory body. Again, I know this is going to cause trouble. I know that lawyers don't want this, because right now in New Zealand, we're witnessing the commodification of survivor abuse by people making a lot of money on what happened to us. So I'm thinking, no, let's get that money for ourselves too. Let's be paid to do the job ourselves. Let's get us qualified and skilled to be gainfully employed in the survivor-led redress system. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here with us down in New Zealand. We're inspired by SNAP's model. It's working for us. People are reaching out to us every day almost here in New Zealand. And we're getting credibility every day, because now the major players who are responsible for the abuse are now taking us very, very seriously, because they've called us to meet with them and to talk to them here in New Zealand as well. So I'll end on that note, and I just want to share with you, and perhaps you can, if you're interested, click on the links that are embedded in these slides, so you can read SNAP's opening statement at the Royal Commission on this slide here, if you just click on that link. And then you can read our closing statement by clicking on that link. And then our official SNAP statement has been published, and that was a privilege, because we had to lobby for that, and we lobbied for that based on advocating that for openness and transparency. And advocating for openness and transparency, we believe that our official statement should be open and transparent to everyone, because that's not part of the protocols of the Royal Commission. All the other submissions have not been published. But ours has. So we're very grateful to the Royal Commission also for hearing us in that regard. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. You know, I often forget how lucky I am, because I get to be in constant communication with you and John, and to see your ideas presented and the work that you guys have done over time presented in this way was just fascinating for me to see, and I'm so glad everyone else got to see the fabulous work that you guys are doing. I'm very grateful to you. We've got a couple of questions here that I thought would be good to toss your way, and I'll start with a really good one here from our SNAP leader down in Mississippi, Mark. And Mark was saying that America is known as a Christian nation, and here, you know, Christians on the right or left would prefer that the issue of clergy and clerical sexual abuse simply go away. And we think that's one of the barriers to why it's difficult that they have these things be investigated here in America. But what does the general population in New Zealand think about religion, and how have you seen, especially you, Chris, who has experience with America, how has that seemed different to you?
Indeed. Thanks for that question, Mark. Thanks, Zach. If you do the research, New Zealand is one of the most secular countries in the world, up there with France. However, we also have an extremely high religious diversity and cultural diversity. So religion is oddly a player in the social fabric of New Zealand. However, the government does not have a Ministry of Religious Affairs. It just doesn't have one. So there's no government agency that controls religion. So there's a very, very clear division between church and state here in New Zealand. And most people really don't care. But those who do care a lot. So there is a divide, but there are no mechanisms in place to handle this high religious diversity. There has been talk here in New Zealand of no longer having separation of church and state. There's been discussion in academics and secular universities in New Zealand that old model of separating church and state was a consequence of the hegemony of the church over the state in the pre-Enlightenment times. Well, what voices are now speaking about in New Zealand, Mark, is subjugating, I shouldn't say subjugating, putting the church under the state insofar as religion being controlled by the state. And of course, that's creating a lot of trouble. So again, New Zealand has a small population. It's highly diverse culturally and religiously, but we have to admit, from a cultural point of view, the majority of New Zealanders still associate or identify with what would be a Christian culture. But again, that's changing rapidly.
Zach, if I can put a comment from the political side, of which I'm active in, New Zealand is 45 to 50% atheist agnostic and rising. The churches are losing and shedding members hand over fist. There is still a remnant culturally of the Judeo-Christian ethic influencing the values of the system, but it has descended into a form of humanism. So you're finding religion, I think, in the next census will be way down what it is now, and atheism and agnosticism will rise. And in fact, that is influencing political policy, social policy, and all the moral issues of society quite heavily. So, and the second point is that there's an attitude within the government, well, if you're stupid enough to get caught up in a religious institution and get your fingers burnt through sexual abuse, well, that's your problem, matey, sort yourself out. So there's little sympathy in some quarters for the problems that's faced. But because it gets into the area of criminality, the states had to step in.
It's very fascinating. Thank you. And very different, certainly from what I'm used to. We've got a good question here. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I don't want this one to go by. So this comes from Patrick, and he says, atrocities by the Catholic Church, such as sexual abuse against First Nation tribes in the United States and Canada, have been given wide exposure by the media. Does your commission investigate sexual abuse by the Catholic Church against the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand? And if so, what's being done to protect your Indigenous children, teens, and adults? Great question, Patrick.
Indeed. Thank you, Patrick. Excellent question. Yes, indeed. There's been an entire hearing, like there was a hearing into abuse in state care and a hearing into abuse in faith-based care. There's been another hearing into abuse towards the Indigenous people of New Zealand. So there being, and the media, this came after us, the media picked up quite heavily on that because indeed, unfortunately, here in New Zealand as well, common to what's happened in Canada and the Indigenous peoples of North America and Australia, sadly have been seen as being easy targets and also manipulated by parents of Indigenous children, accepting the pathetic payments, the insulting payments, simply because they're in financial need. So that's being looked at heavily, Patrick. And again, there's a special niche in the inquiry for Indigenous peoples in New Zealand.
I'm glad that you mentioned that bit about payments. I mean, certainly the same thing is true here, likely in every institution, every country in which the institution operates. But, folks in poor areas of the country here, immigrants, First Nations people, all treated that same second-class kind of way. So I'm glad that you guys are bringing attention to it.
Indeed.
So with that, I want to say, first, Chris mentioned a lot of links. Melanie kindly said, to email her if you're having trouble getting those links. You can do the same with me, and we'll be happy to share the fabulous work of Chris and John and Snap Aotearoa New Zealand with you, because it is wonderful. It needs to be shared. They're doing fabulous work on behalf of survivors. Their voices are extremely powerful, and I'm glad that you were able to hear them today. So with that,
Thanks,
I will
Zach.
say goodbye to Chris and John. I'll talk to you shortly. And for everyone else, we'll see you in a few minutes for the final session of the day. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Zach.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
John. Bye.
Take care.